Welcome to Dusky Lore. Close your eyes, dim the lights, and listen closely as the shadows begin to speak. Story 1. There is a kind of silence that only exists above the tree line. City people think they know silence because they can hear the hum of their refrigerator at 3 o'clock in the morning, or the occasional siren a few streets away. That is not silence. True silence appears when the world falls away in every direction, and the only sound left is your own pulse pushing blood beside your ears. That was what I went looking for that summer when I accepted the job as a lookout in a fire tower. I was 26 years old, a graduate student with a half-finished thesis on environmental policy and a head full of noise. My advisor said I was overthinking the structure. My friend said I needed a break. I told everyone I would spend 3 months in a remote fire lookout tower in the Oregon Cascades, so I could focus on my research readings without distractions. The truth was more embarrassing. I wanted to disappear in a way that did not look like giving up. The tower had a name that sounded almost romantic on the assignment sheet, something like Eagle Crest, but the building itself was nothing more than a glass box on stilts at the top of a ridge. The only way to reach it was by a steep trail full of sharp switchbacks that took 3 hours with a heavy pack. Supplies came twice a month if the weather allowed it. The rest of the time it was just you, a radio, binoculars, and the sky. On the first day, the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio while I stood in the cabin, surrounded by windows. "Look out, this is base. Radio check over." Awkwardly, I adjusted the headset. The black plastic still held the warmth of the previous person's hands. "Base, this is Eagle Crest. I read you 5 by 5 over." My voice sounded too loud inside that small room. Outside, the horizon stretched in uneven blue waves, layer after layer of ridges fading into the haze. The clouds hung like torn cotton over the distant peaks. I felt enormous and at the same time very, very small. The routine, once I learned it, was simple. Wake up at dawn, check the sky, record the weather conditions, scan all 360 degrees of forest with the binoculars, looking for the one thing you did not want to see, a thin, unnatural column of smoke. Report every hour, or more often if anything changed. Read, cook, pace back and forth. Watch storms approach or dissolve. At night, make one last status call. Then try to sleep in a bed that creaked with every breath of wind. During the first week, the radio was my lifeline. The check-ins with base, the conversations from 2 other lookouts stationed on distant ridges, the occasional helicopter pilot reporting position. The voices became familiar faster than I expected. A woman on the western ridge with a dry sense of humor. A man to the south who always sounded like he was halfway through a joke. It was like living in your own private neighborhood suspended in the sky. The second week I heard her for the first time. It was late afternoon. One of those clear, hot, shimmering days that make every line of the mountain look carved from glass. I had just finished a routine report. No smoke, light wind from the northwest, excellent visibility. I lifted my finger from the transmit button and started to take off the headset when I heard it. "Copy Eagle Crest," base said. "Log received. Base out." There was the usual burst of static at the end of the transmission. And then faintly, so faintly I almost missed it, a second voice slid beneath the hiss. "Eagle Crest, 4137, 4137. The numbers were spoken in a woman's voice, calm, precise, like someone reading coordinates from a map. The sound was so brief that I could have dismissed it as some kind of interference, but the cadence felt intentional, deliberate. I lifted the headset again. "Base, did you just repeat my coordinates?" I asked. There was a pause. "Negative, Eagle Crest," the dispatcher said. "Did you catch a ghost on your end? We've got some weird propagation today." Could be bleed over from the south frequency. Copy. Over. I looked out toward the ridges. Yeah, I said. Copy. Must be the atmosphere or something. Eagle crest out. I hung the headset carefully on its hook. The plastic suddenly felt heavier in my hand. The coordinates she had repeated, because that was what it felt like, a repetition, were mine. The numbers I had just given base as my position. I told myself it had only been a glitch. Radios do strange things in the mountains. Signals bounce, cross, refract. That is what everyone says. That night I woke to the sound of wind shaking the tower. The windows vibrated in their frames. Lightning flashed somewhere far away, turning the panes into momentary mirrors. Storms were part of the job. I had read the manual twice on what to do if lightning struck the tower. Stand on the insulated mat. Keep your hands away from metal. Do not panic. The radio crackled. I turned over in bed, disoriented, and looked at the clock. 3:02 a.m. A soft hiss filled the cabin. Then, as clear as my own thoughts, the same woman's voice wove itself through the static. 4137, 4137, elevation 5,892, visibility compromised. The last word stretched slightly, as if it had been warped by distance. I got out of bed and crossed the room in 3 steps, careful not to touch the metal table. My fingers were trembling when I lifted the headset. "This is Eagle Crest," I said. "Who is this?" "Repeat your identifier." "Over." The hiss grew louder, drowning the last syllable. There was no answer. I stood there for a full minute, the headset pressed to my ear, listening to nothing but the crackle of the storm. Finally, I put it back in place and followed the procedures mechanically. Check the lightning chart, write down the time, remind myself that strange echoes happened on those frequencies all the time. Other lookouts talking to their bases, logging crews, pilots. But when I lay down again, the number she had spoken dragged through my mind like an anchor. 4137, my coordinates again, and my elevation too. The next morning, I flipped through the station notebook looking for old entries. Every lookout leaves a log for the next one. Weather notes, minor repairs, drawings, the occasional joke. As I moved backward through years of tight handwriting, I started to notice a pattern. Every now and then, some lookout mentioned strange radio traffic in the margins. I think I heard a woman repeat my position. Propagation. Static at 3 o'clock. Would have sworn someone called the tower by name. Dreamed someone was here with me, whispering coordinates. Maybe too much instant coffee. The notes were scattered, separated by years, written in different handwriting. But they all had the same nervous, evasive tone. No one had treated it like something real. Just oddities. A ghost story to tell once you came down from the mountain. I told myself I would not be like them. I would document everything. I would be rational, at least for a while. The voice stayed away. The storm passed. The days turned into a blurry mixture of heat, the smell of resin, and distant columns of dust kicked up by logging trucks. I fell into my own rhythms. I read until my eyes blurred. I wrote pages of my thesis by hand in a spiral notebook. In the evenings, I watched the sun melt into the horizon and thought that maybe I was healing in a way that was hard to explain. Then the voice returned, and it stopped being about coordinates. It was a week later, again around 3 o'clock in the morning. I had started to fear that hour when the night seems densest. I woke with a jolt, my heart racing, with the feeling that someone had spoken my name. Not my last name, not my call sign, my first name, Elodie. The tower was dark except for the red eye of the radio's power indicator. Outside, the sky was an empty stain, starless, the clouds blocking any trace of moonlight. I listened. At first, nothing. Only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights cooling above my head. The low murmur of wind in the guy wires. Then, Elodie. It was the same voice, now closer. Not inside the room, but not as far away as before either. Like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. Elodie, copy. 4137. Alone. No smoke. Emotion. Uneasy. The last word sank under my skin. Emotion. No one on the fire network talked that way. You reported facts, not feelings. I had written uneasy in my journal that same night, just before falling asleep. I had underlined it twice. I grabbed my notebook from the small shelf above the bed and opened it. The last entry was there, in my own slanted handwriting. July 11th. Wind, no smoke. I feel uneasy, as if the tower is too small, as if something is walking just beyond the windows. My palms went cold. This is Eagle Crest, I said hoarsely into the headset. Identify yourself. What is your location? Over. Silence. I forced myself to count to 30. If you are another lookout, you need to use proper protocol, I said. We can log your position. Do you copy? Over. The static came like a wave and then receded. No response. In the morning, I called base as usual. I kept my finger suspended over the transmit button, wondering whether I should mention the unauthorized traffic. My mind arranged all the reasons not to. Maybe it was a prank on a neighboring frequency. Maybe I had been half asleep and mistaken gusts of wind for words. Maybe. Eagle Crest, this is base, the dispatcher said. You're a little late for your first check-in. Everything all right up there? Over. I looked at the ring of distant mountains. Everything is fine, I said. No smoke, good visibility. Eagle Crest out. As soon as I said it, I wished I had told the truth as I felt it, that something up there had learned my name. The next time the voice came, it avoided the radio completely. It was night. The sunset had spilled across the sky in bruised purple and molten orange. I had already done my final sweep, recorded the absence of anything new, and sat down at the rickety table with my notebook. I decided I would take control of the narrative the way any good researcher would, by gathering data. I wrote down the times the voice had appeared, what it had said, the weather conditions. I noted that it seemed to prefer 3 a.m., that it repeated coordinates, that it had started imitating my private writing. I wrote one more line, the question I did not want to admit I was asking. What do you want? The radio hissed, though I had not touched it. Eagle Crest, the woman's voice murmured. Not in my ears, but inside my head, as clearly as if she were standing behind me. What do you want? I froze. The pen slipped from my hand and rolled across the table. She continued in an almost clinical, observational tone. Subject, Elodie. Duration at station, 15 days. Sleep interrupted. Effect, anxiety. Desire to disappear without disappearing. No, I whispered. That's not how this works. My reflection stared back at me from the darkening windows, pale with sunken eyes. I stood up abruptly and walked to the cabinet where the manuals and old logbooks were kept. My hands were moving before my thoughts could catch up. I pulled out a water-warped folder labeled Incident Reports and opened it. Most of it was dry bureaucracy, minor injuries, lightning strikes, equipment failures. But in the middle, fastened between pages with a rusted paper clip, was a photocopy of a newspaper article. Local lookout disappears during storm. Search team suspended after 5 days. The photo beneath the headline showed a woman leaning against the railing of a lookout tower. The wind pushed her hair away from a determined face. The caption identified her as Beatrice. I read the article. She had been assigned to another tower, one that no longer existed, 2 ridges away. A sudden storm had formed. Radio contact was lost. By the time a ground crew managed to make its way to the tower, the cabin was empty. The logbook entry stopped abruptly in the middle of a sentence. There were no signs of a fall, no tracks leading away from the place. It was as if she had stepped out of existence. The date was from 21 years earlier. The coordinates listed for her tower were not the same as mine, but close enough that we would both have seen the same storms. My skin prickled. I looked at the last page of her recovered notes, reproduced in the file. The last line was incomplete. 0300, heard voice repeating, "No more." The radio headset still hung on its hook, black innocent plastic catching the last light. I did not touch it. I did not say her name out loud. That night the storm arrived without lightning. The wind rose, howling around the tower, making the structure tremble on its stilts. The clouds swallowed every star. At 3 a.m., like a clock striking the hour, the radio came alive. "Eagle Crest, do you copy?" The woman's voice. No bass, no call sign I recognized. Only me. I stayed in bed, the blanket pulled up to my chin, staring at the radio's faint red eye. "You should answer," she said softly. "They will mark you as non-responsive." "Who are you?" I whispered. A soft laugh without humor. "I am what you came here to become," she said. "A signal without a source, coordinates without a body, a voice recorded on paper after the fact." The wind shook the windows. The tower creaked. My heart struck so hard I thought it might split my ribs. "You repeat my coordinates," I said. "You read my journal." "I keep count," she replied, "of who is alone, of who wants out, of who is already halfway gone." Something moved at the edge of my vision. For a moment I thought I saw a pale figure reflected in the glass, standing just behind my shoulder. Not completely formed. More suggestion than person. Hair lifted by an invisible wind. Eyes like distant storms. "If you leave now," she said softly, "no one will know where you went. There will be reports, searches. The records will be photocopied. You will be written down in more detail than you have ever written yourself. You will belong to this place." My hand found the rough grain of the wooden wall beside the bed. Splinters dug into my palm. "I don't want that," I said. My voice trembled. "I thought I did, but I don't." The silence stretched. The wind moaned in the guy wires like a low human cry. "Then you will have to go back," she said at last. "Back completely to the city, to your unfinished life. You will not sleep as well. The noise will never be as clean. But when you wake at 3 a.m., you will still be inside your own walls." The radio went silent. The light on its face shrank to a tiny point. My contract was for 3 months. I lasted 6 more days. I called base and told them I was having health problems, anxiety, trouble sleeping, intrusive thoughts. All of it was true, though not the whole truth. They were short-staffed and clearly annoyed, but they arranged to send a relief lookout. The day I left, I carried the incident folder with Beatrice's article to the edge of the desk. I hesitated. Then I pushed it back. Someone else would need it more than I did. The hike down felt longer than the hike up. With every bend in the trail, the air grew denser, full of insects and the smell of wet earth. Halfway down, I turned once and looked back at the small square of the tower against the sky. From that angle, it looked fragile, like something a gust could tear from the ridge. For an instant, I thought I heard a faint crackle inside my backpack, as if the radio I had already handed over were still with me. A whisper of numbers, 4,137. I kept walking. Back in the city, people asked me what it had been like. They wanted romantic stories about sunsets and storm clouds, about solitude and inspiration. I gave them what they expected. I talked about the views, the storms, the time I saw a family of deer move carefully along a ridge at dawn. I did not talk about the woman who had learned my name. 2 years have passed. I finished my thesis. I sleep through most nights. Almost. Sometimes at 3 a.m. I wake suddenly in my apartment, my heart racing, certain that someone has just repeated my address in a calm, observant voice. When that happens, I stay very still and listen. There is always a noise here. Traffic on the avenue, a neighbor's pipes, the refrigerator switching on. Ordinary human sounds. But underneath it all, if I listen long enough, I can still feel that other silence, the one that settles over mountain peaks and abandoned towers, the one that waits. Now there are new lookouts up there, new names, new notebooks, new private worries. On dry days, when wildfire maps burst with red polygons, I check the updates more often than I should. Sometimes small lines appear in the incident summaries. Brief communications interruption at 3 o'clock. Unidentified transmission on channel. I wonder if they will dismiss it the way I tried to. I wonder if any of them will open the incident folder and see the photo of Beatrice standing where I stood. I wonder how many times she will patiently repeat their coordinates before someone answers. Story 2. It is strange to admit that the worst thing that has ever happened to me began with something that, at the time, felt like a new beginning. I had just turned 23. I was exhausted from life in the city of Portland and tired of spending my days staring at spreadsheets in a windowless office. The Pacific Northwest had always seemed to me like a postcard on the other side of the glass. Something beautiful I only looked at on my computer's lock screen. So when a temporary trail maintenance position opened up in a national forest in Washington, I accepted it without thinking twice. I told my parents I needed clean air and open sky. What I actually needed was to feel small in a place larger than my anxiety. The town where the ranger station was located was little more than a main street, a closed sawmill, and a bar whose neon beer signs seemed to never turn off. I arrived in late May, when the snow still clung to the highest ridges, but the lower trails were already beginning to open. Housing was included, which sounded ideal when you barely have any savings. They put all of us seasonal workers in an old bunkhouse a few miles from the station, hidden among the trees at the end of a gravel road. The first night I stood outside with my duffel bag, listening to the wind comb through the fir branches and the distant murmur of the river, and I thought, this is exactly what I needed. Inside, the bunkhouse smelled like damp wood and coffee. There were 4 of us that season. 2 guys who had already done that kind of work before and spoke in abbreviations about SAW certifications and trail numbers. A woman from Utah who was there mainly to climb on every day off. And then another new employee like me. His name was Oliver. Oliver kept to himself almost from the first minute. He chose the bunk in the farthest corner beside the small window, lined up his gear with military precision, and answered questions with polite, short, sharp sentences. He had dark hair, pale skin, like someone who had spent more time in libraries than under the sun, and eyes that never met yours for more than a second. I told myself he was simply shy. Not everyone fills silence with chatter the way I do when I'm nervous. During training, the 4 of us learned chainsaw safety, cross-cut saw techniques, how to remove fallen trees, and how to deal with weekend hikers who think moderate means hiking in sandals. We also learned almost as an aside that forest had its share of missing people. People who underestimated distances. People who became disoriented in sudden changes of weather. People who decided that an unmarked animal trail looked interesting. Our supervisor talked about them the way someone mentions a bad winter storm that happened years ago. A tragic fact, yes, but not immediately relevant. The first time I went out on a trail crew with Oliver, I noticed how much he watched people. At the first major trailhead, cars were lined up in the gravel turnout, their windows still fogged from breath. We checked the notice board, the fresh boot prints in the mud, and the register where people were supposed to write their names and planned routes. Most people did not bother. While we unloaded tools from the truck, I saw Oliver's eyes move from face to face, stopping briefly on each group. A couple with brand new backpacks. A man alone with minimal gear and expensive trail running shoes. A family whose 2 teenagers already looked exhausted. Pretty busy for a weekday, I said, more to break the silence than anything else. Oliver nodded. Good visibility today. It's hard to get lost when the sky is like this. It sounded like a normal comment, but something in his tone made me glance at him sideways. His expression was impossible to read. The first few weeks settled into a routine. Wake up before dawn, coffee, load tools, long drives down washboard roads, hours clearing brush and cutting fallen logs. At night, my shoulders ached in a way that felt clean, earned. The bunkhouse filled with the hiss of the gas stove, wet socks hanging from every exposed beam, and the muffled laughter of the others playing cards at the main table. Oliver almost always sat apart, reading or sharpening his tools with an almost obsessive meticulousness. If he spoke at length about anything, it was the layout of the forest. He seemed to carry a map inside his head. He knew which streams rose after rain, which slopes held snow well into summer, which unofficial shortcuts the locals used to reach fishing spots. At first, I admired him. I would ask him about alternate routes when we were walking back, and my legs felt like rubber, and he always knew one. You have a good sense of direction, I told him once, trying again to reach that part of him that seemed to live behind his pale eyes. He shrugged. You either pay attention or you disappear out here. That's all. The first small thing that unsettled me happened during the 3rd week. They posted a notice on the station corkboard about a hiker who had not returned from a weekend outing. Male, late 30s, last seen at the same trailhead we used for one of our longer routes. It was not yet a formal search. More of a radio in if you see him alert. The photo showed a man with an easy smile and a very distinctive blue water bottle clipped to his backpack. 2 days later, I was outside the bunkhouse, rummaging through the back of our vehicle for a spare pair of gloves, when I saw it. A blue water bottle of the same style, scraped in the same places as the one in the photo, lying inside a plastic milk crate full of miscellaneous gear in the back of the truck. At first, I thought maybe it was a coincidence. That model was fairly common, but when I picked it up, I saw the faint outline of a sticker that had been peeled off. In the photo of the missing hiker, the sticker was a small mountain logo. I hesitated. Then I carried it inside. Did anyone lose a bottle? I asked, holding it up. One of the veteran guys looked over at me. Must be from last season. Lost and found, maybe. Leave it in the kitchen. Someone will use it. Oliver looked up from his book. His eyes passed over the bottle and then moved away. People forget things all the time, he said. There was nothing in his voice I could grab onto, nothing I could point to and say, that was wrong. I left the bottle in the kitchen and tried not to think about it anymore. The search notice disappeared a week later. No one said whether they had found the man. As July approached, the forest filled with more people and more stories. 2 teenage girls left their map in the car and had to be guided back before dark. A mountain runner twisted his ankle 4 miles from the parking lot. A family misread the loop distance and came dragging their feet back to their truck long after sunset. The parents yelling at each other from exhaustion. Every time we heard different versions over the radio, facts mixed up by panic and by the weak signal bouncing against the ridges. If this were only a story about the randomness of accidents in the wilderness, I probably would not be telling it. But it is not. The second thing that happened was harder to dismiss. We had just finished a long day clearing a trail that climbed up to a fire lookout tower. My arms felt like jelly and my nose was sunburned. When we got back to the bunkhouse entrance, the others went inside, but I stayed outside for a minute to stretch and finish my water. Oliver remained by the truck, the tailgate open, doing tool inventory as usual. When he pulled a tarp aside, something slid out and hit the bed with a dull thud. A backpack, old dirty, with a tear in the top pocket. There was something about it that made my stomach tighten. I had seen that backpack before, hanging on the lost gear board at the ranger station as an example of what not to buy. Cheap unknown brand, unreliable buckles. The supervisor had told a brief story about a hiker whose pack opened on a steep section and how half of his gear rolled down a ravine. "Where did you get that?" I asked. Oliver did not look up. It was at the trailhead. Someone probably left it by the trash. People ditch gear they don't want to carry back. The answer came too quickly. I stepped a little closer. The fabric was stained with something darker than mud. I wanted to believe it was spilled coffee or sap, but the pattern did not look right. My heart pounded inside my ears. "We should turn it in," I said, "in case it belongs to someone on the missing persons list." Then he did look up. His face was calm, almost amused. "You think every piece of trash in this truck belongs to a missing person?" His eyes held mine longer than they ever had before. "If you think that way, you're not going to sleep out here." He tossed the backpack back under the tarp with a careless motion, as if it truly were nothing but trash. I said nothing else. But that night, lying awake in my bunk, listening to the others snore, I kept seeing that stain. After that, I started noticing more small coincidences. A GPS device that appeared on the bunkhouse table, with a battery that barely held enough charge to show a saved route that veered abruptly off a main trail into blank space. A pair of trekking poles with fluorescent tape on the grips, identical to ones mentioned in a printed bulletin of people to contact if seen. None of it was proof. Nothing on its own was enough to call anyone. But all of it together settled like stones in my stomach. The day everything clicked into place, the sky was a flat, unbroken gray. Low clouds dragged themselves over the ridges like wet cotton. Our supervisor split us into pairs and sent Oliver and me to remove fallen trees on a little-used trail that climbed up the east side of a remote basin. We worked mostly in silence, with the buzz of the saw filling the space between us. Toward mid-afternoon, while we rested on a log and drank lukewarm water, Oliver spoke. "There's a shortcut from here," he said. "If we take it, we can loop back to the truck without having to return the way we came." A shortcut? I pulled out my folded map. Our position was roughly halfway along the trail. On paper, the only way in or out was the way we had come. He touched a spot to the right of the trail, where the contour lines pressed tightly together. "Old logging spur. It doesn't show up on the map anymore, but it's still there. Locals use it to get to the river. Saves an hour." I hesitated. The day was moving on. The clouds had dropped and a damp chill was slipping under my shirt. The idea of shortening the hike was tempting. Even so, something inside me resisted leaving the printed line on the map. "Is it marked?" I asked. He smiled thinly without humor. "Not officially, but I've been through there plenty of times. You can trust me." I wish I could say that phrase alone made me refuse. It did not. It was the combination of exhaustion, the promise of an earlier dinner, and the unjustified belief that nothing truly bad was going to happen to me. I folded the map. "You lead," I said. We left the trail through a small opening in the brush that I never would have noticed on my own. The terrain sloped downward, soft with pine needles, and soon the sense of direction I had carefully been building all season began to unravel. The spur he had mentioned was more like a ghost, two barely visible ruts beneath ferns and salal, cut apart by time and erosion. The trees grew very close together, their trunks covered in moss that absorbed sound. Within minutes, the trail we had left might as well have been in another country. "How much farther?" I asked. "Not far," he said. "You'll hear the river soon." The deeper we went, the more that familiar unease returned, that tingling alertness at the base of my skull. Oliver walked half a step ahead, unhurried. The saw rested on his shoulder like an extension of his body. There was a quiet confidence in the way he moved, like someone following a route rehearsed many times. I thought of the missing hiker's water bottle, the backpack, the GPS route that led into nothing. "Do you ever think about them?" I asked, surprising myself. "About who?" he said without turning around. "The people who disappear out here." He seemed to consider it. Sometimes people romanticize the idea of fading into the forest. They don't understand that it almost always comes down to stupid decisions. "Stupid decisions," I repeated, like following an unmarked spur. He let out a laugh, but there was no warmth in it. "You followed me." The trees suddenly opened into a small clearing, no larger than a living room. The ground there was scraped and bare in places, blackened by old fires. Charred cans and melted plastic lay half buried in the dirt. It looked like the kind of unofficial campsite teenagers would use for drinking and leaving everything behind. In the center was a low pile of remains. At first, I thought it was only trash. Twisted metal, torn fabric, half-burned nylon. Then I saw the shape of a boot. The sole melted into a warped tar-like smear. A strip of jacket material, once brightly colored, fused to a rock. And that faint, sickly sweet smell that did not belong to wood smoke. My breath cut off. "What is this?" My voice sounded thin in my own ears. Oliver set the saw down gently, as if we had arrived at a destination agreed upon in advance. "People come here," he said. "They get lost. They get hurt. Sometimes they're never found. The forest keeps what is given to it." He looked at me, but this time he truly looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that turned my stomach. It was not madness, not the way they show it in movies. It was something colder, a kind of clinical interest. "How did you find this place?" I asked. "The same way you did," he said softly. "I followed someone I thought I could trust." He took a small step toward me. The clearing suddenly felt very far from any road, any trail, any radio signal. The clouds pressed lower, dimming the light. Sound seemed to be swallowed before it reached the treetops. "I left a note," I blurted out. The words came rushing out before I even realized I had planned them. At the bunkhouse, I told them which trail we'd be on, what time we were supposed to be back. That was not entirely true. That morning I had scribbled something quickly on the whiteboard, more out of habit than fear. But I said it with the certainty of someone pronouncing a sentence. For a moment, nothing changed. Then a sound split the silence, a dry crack like a door slamming shut. It took me a second to realize it was coming from above, somewhere back toward the main trail. A second later, the forest returned the echo of a distant radio tone, followed by a faint voice we could not understand. Oliver's head turned toward the sound. His jaw tightened just enough for me to notice. "Sounds like they're checking our position," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "We're late." The spell broke, if that was what it had been. Oliver looked back at me. Something trembled behind his eyes. "We should go," he said. "The weather is changing." We climbed back toward the main trail in a silence so thick it felt like a third presence between us. My legs trembled, more from adrenaline than effort. When we finally stepped back onto the honest dirt of the official route, the familiar markings on the trees looked like lifelines. We reached the truck just as our supervisor was calling again over the radio, asking for our location. I let Oliver answer. His voice sounded steady as he gave approximate coordinates. He did not mention our detour. He did not mention the clearing. That night I sat on my bunk with my bag already packed at my feet. The decision had solidified somewhere between that pile of burned gear and the first white trail marker on the way back. The next morning I went into town and told my supervisor there had been a family emergency. I did not give details. He did not press. I left in less than 48 hours. 3 years have passed. Now I live in another state, in a city large enough that the horizon is made of buildings instead of mountain ridges. I still hike, but only on crowded routes, where you can always see another person's brightly colored jacket ahead of you. Some nights I still wake up convinced I can smell that faint, sickly sweet scent of burned plastic and something else. I check news alerts about that forest more often than I would like to admit. Last winter, an article appeared in my feed about a cluster of unsolved disappearances in that region. There were enough of them to cause a small wave of media attention before disappearing beneath more urgent headlines. There was a photo of a familiar trailhead, cars lined up in the gravel turnout, people smiling, adjusting their backpacks, unaware that the trees were watching them. I studied every face in the image, looking for Oliver. He was not there. I do not know whether that is better or worse. Story 3. My grandmother used to say, "The forest remembers every deal you make with it." When I was a child and spent sticky summers in her small coastal town in the Pacific Northwest, that phrase seemed almost comforting to me, as if the forest were an enormous old aunt keeping track of birthday gifts. Only much later did I understand that she meant every deal, even the ones you do not know you were making. Her house sat above a strip of second-growth forest and swampy creek beds, with a single uneven trail that led down toward what everyone simply called the green. On the wall above the kitchen table hung a faded photograph of a cedar stump, so immense that 3 children could stand shoulder to shoulder inside the hollow. She called it the mother. In her stories, loggers who took more than they needed, or hunters who killed for fun, always ended up finding their way back to that stump, sometimes alive, sometimes not. I forgot those stories for years, the way one forgets lullabies. Then after the accident, they all came back at once. The accident took up 3 sentences in the news. A drunk driver, a rainy night, someone else's taillight spinning and disappearing from sight. My partner Daniel walked away alive, with a concussion and a glass cut on his shoulder. The other driver did not walk away. After the court dates, the insurance calls, and the endless parade of people saying it could have been worse, the 2 of us were left with the same unspoken question. Why did we get to keep going when someone else did not? I was the one who suggested going back to my grandmother's town. She had been dead for years by then, and the house had been sold to a couple from Seattle, but the forest was still there. I told myself we would walk the old trails, breathe salt and cedar, and somehow that would drain the poison from our heads. We followed the same uneven path from the roadside turnout, past the tangle of blackberry bushes and the rusted fence post that had been there since I was 8 years old. The green swallowed us faster than I remembered. Salal leaves brushed our knees. Slanted rays of light turned dust motes into slowly falling stars. Daniel walked ahead of me, his shoulders hunched, the scar at his temple like a pale crescent against his tan skin. The clearing was not where it used to be, or maybe the forest had moved around it. We almost walked past it. One moment there were trees everywhere. The next we stepped into a circle of open light. And there it was. The mother had rotted over the years since that photograph in the kitchen. The stump was still enormous, taller than my chest, but the wood was covered in moss, and its heart had been eaten out into a dark, wet bowl. Someone had been there recently. Glass jars filled with berries and coins rested along the rim. A rusted chainsaw blade lay at the base like an offering, and pinned beneath a stone, its corners curling from the damp, was a missing person flyer. The man's face looked tired and kind. Local logger remains missing after 3 weeks. These things show up everywhere, Daniel murmured, looking away. Are you okay? I asked. He was already kneeling beside the stump. I dream about this place, he said quietly. I didn't know what it was, but it was this shape, like something waiting with its hands open. He touched the moss with the tips of his fingers. For a second, I wanted to pull him away from it the way you pull a child away from a hot pan. Maybe we should go, I said. We can come back another day. Or we can ask it, he said without looking at me, the way your grandmother would have. The way he said it made my skin prickle. I had never told him even half of those childhood stories. I opened my mouth to tell him so and tasted cedar and iron on my tongue. We don't have anything to give it, I managed to say. Daniel slowly stood and turned toward me. His eyes were wet, but not with tears. It was as if the color inside them had loosened. We have too much, he said. That's the problem. We did not kneel. We did not chant. We did not cut our palms. There was no ritual. We just stood there, the two of us, beside the stump and among the silent trees. In my head, the words arranged themselves without my permission. Take this weight. Take the nights when he wakes up choking. Take the replay of headlights and metal. Take the fact that we are still here when that man is not. The forest listened. I felt it. The same way you feel when a room hears something you have just said and can no longer take back. On the walk back, Daniel moved with a lightness I had not seen in him for months. He talked about small things, coffee shops back home, a movie he wanted to see, how he should call his sister. The knot between his shoulders had loosened as if someone had cut it. I, on the other hand, felt as if my bones had been filled with wet sand. Every step was an effort. By the time we reached the car, my hands were shaking. You look pale, he said, frowning. Maybe I was the one who needed this trip less. He drove back to the city. I watched the green slide past the window and had the irrational thought that if I blinked for too long, the trees would appear inside the car with us. The nightmares began that same week. They were not about the accident. Those had been Daniel's. Mine were about wood opening. In the dreams, I was in that clearing while the cedar stump flexed, its rotten heart splitting open to reveal faces pressed into the grain. Eyes, mouths, and the faint white half-circle of teeth, all overlapping like growth rings. I recognized some of them from news articles I had skimmed and then forgotten. Others were strangers. All of them looked at me with the same exhausted relief, as if I had finally arrived to cover my shift. You gave it to him, a voice said. My grandmother's, from nowhere and everywhere. You didn't think about what it would want from you. I woke with my jaw clenched so tightly that my teeth hurt. Daniel got better. He started sleeping through the night. He stopped flinching when a car backfired or when someone dropped a pan. The guilt that had lived in his shoulders grew thinner, something manageable. He signed up for a night class. Sometimes he laughed with his whole chest. I stopped going out alone. It took me a while to recognize the pattern. Rain made it worse. On wet mornings, every tree on the street felt like a spine at my back. Cedars, firs, even those sad little ornamental trees planted in sidewalk squares. They all seemed to lean when I passed. More than once, I thought I heard a low creak above me, followed by a soft, wet sigh. I tried to ignore it. I walked down the center of the sidewalk. I took buses instead of cutting through the small park near our apartment. The city was not a forest, I told myself. Concrete, traffic, and a few scattered trees were nothing compared to the endless green of my childhood. Then one gray afternoon, I made the mistake of cutting through that park anyway. It was faster. I was late. The umbrella dripped in my hand. The path curved through a group of cedars someone had planted years earlier to make the space feel less sterile. I took 3 steps before the world narrowed. The air grew thick, heavy with the same smell of wet rot from that stump. My ears plugged. The noise of the street faded into a dull hum. For a second, the trunks around me seemed wider, older. Their bark folded into familiar lines. I stopped. The feeling of being watched pressed in on me from every side, intimate and impersonal at once. A weight settled over my shoulders. They were not exactly hands, but they were not hands either. "You something breathed. Not with words, but in the same way a storm cloud promises rain. I backed out of the trees the way you back away from an animal you do not want to startle. When I reached the sidewalk, the spell broke. The city sounds returned all at once. Horns, footsteps, someone laughing while talking on the phone. The cedars behind me looked small and harmless. Their branches trembled under the drizzle like any other trees. I did not tell Daniel. How do you say, the forest followed us and is asking for the rest of what I promised? He is well. He now volunteers with a road safety group. Sometimes he talks about going back to the coast when the weather is nice. Maybe spending a few days walking those old trails I used to love. I always change the subject. I know this sounds irrational. Trauma does strange things. I could go back to therapy and arrange all of this under neat labels. Survivor's guilt, projection, magical thinking. But when I imagine stepping beneath cedar branches again, alone, my body responds before my mind can. My throat closes. My palms sweat. My feet stay nailed to the pavement. My grandmother used to say, "The forest remembers every deal you make with it." I did not understand that there is no such thing as partial payment. You cannot leave your guilt in an old stump and walk away clean. Some days I feel like I am living on borrowed ground, a piece of concrete above roots that reach much deeper than the pipes and cables beneath the city. On those days, I do not look up. I do not want to check whether the city trees are leaning just slightly in my direction. Waiting for the moment when I wander far enough from the crowds for the mother to claim the rest of the dead of the dead. Story 4. The thing about traditions is that you never really expect them to end. You assume there will always be another summer, another long drive, another set of half-drunk photos taken at the same crooked cabin beside the same crooked lake. That was what that place was for us. Proof that no matter how complicated life in the city became, there was still a piece of water and trees that belonged only to our little group. We started going to Cedar Glass Lake the summer after we graduated from college. It did not appear on any of those top 10 alpine lakes lists, and we liked that. To get there, you had to follow a potholed forest road in Washington until it narrowed and turned into a tunnel of fir trees. Then you took a trail on foot that dropped you into a kind of blue bowl surrounded by dark slopes. The campground was tiny, barely a handful of sites hidden among the trees. There was no cell service, no motorboats, only the soft slap of water against rocks and every now and then, the call of a loon bouncing off the cliffs. By the time everything happened, we had been returning there for 7 years. The same time every August. The same group. Me, the unofficial planner. Nate and Mia, always about to break up and always getting back together. Jonah, quiet and steady. And Harriet. Harriet was the one who loved the lake most. I think she was the loudest person in any room, the first one into the water, no matter how cold it was, the one who insisted on night swimming under the stars with cheap glow bracelets tied around our wrists. She had grown up in landlocked suburbs. The lake, she used to joke, was the closest thing to a religion she had. That last year, she was different. I noticed it even before we left the city, when she slid into the passenger seat beside me. Normally, she would have been vibrating with excitement, with the playlist already prepared, stuffing gas station snacks into the door compartment. Instead, she only buckled her seatbelt and stared through the windshield, drumming her fingers on her knee in a silent rhythm. "Are you okay?" I asked when we merged onto the highway. "Yeah," she said. "I'm just tired." Her voice had a fragile, papery texture that I did not like. I assumed it was work, or maybe some new mess with that on-again, off-again ex she never quite managed to let go of. I decided to give her space and let the miles unfold in front of us. We reached the campground in mid-afternoon. The sun fell at an angle over the water, turning it that deep, crystalline green that gave the lake its name. While we set up the tents, Jonah called us over from the notice board beside the pit toilets. "Look at this," he said. Among the usual fire warnings and park rules, there was a photocopied newspaper clipping. The paper was wrinkled from moisture and the ink had run slightly. "Local family presumed drowned after boat capsizes. Search suspended at Cedar Glass Lake." The photo showed a man, a woman, and a small child in life jackets, all squinting and smiling at the camera from the shore. The article was old, from the 1970s, yellowed at the edges. Someone had underlined a paragraph in blue pen. "Despite calm conditions, no bodies were recovered. Locals have long considered the lake deeper than it appears." I looked at Harriet. She was staring at the photograph so intensely that her jaw trembled. "Super reassuring," Mia said dryly. "Great vibes, Forest Service." "Probably some seasonal ranger's idea of a safety campaign," I said. "Wear your life jacket, kids, or you'll end up on the corkboard." But that night, sitting around the fire, I caught Harriet looking again and again toward the dark outline of the board, as if it were a person standing just beyond the circle of light. The second day was for the water. That was the rule. No hikes, no side trips, just the lake. We floated in inflatable tubes. We took turns in the battered canoe that came with our sight. We let the sun draw the city out of our bones. For a few hours, it almost felt like any other year. Later, when the sky began to bruise into shades of purple and the trees dissolved into silhouettes, Harriet asked me to go out with her in the canoe. "One more time before it gets completely dark." "Bring a headlamp," Jonah called behind us. "The last thing we need is to star in part 2 of the bulletin board article." Harriet did not laugh. She only pushed the canoe into the water and climbed in with a sharp, decisive movement. I followed, kneeling to keep my balance as we moved away from the shore. At first, we paddled without speaking, the boat cutting a V of ripples across the smooth surface. The camp lights shrank behind us. The familiar chorus of frogs and insects rose from the shore. Far away on the other side of the lake, a loon released that long, mournful note that always made the hair on my arms stand up. We drifted toward the center, where the water felt wider than it looked from shore. The last trace of sunset stretched like a pale band over the hills. The first stars tested the darkness. "That article," Harriet said suddenly. "You remember that it said they never found them?" "Yeah," I said. "But that was decades ago. I'm sure this place has been searched a dozen times since then." "Do you ever wonder why?" she continued, her gaze fixed on the mirror-smooth water. "Why what?" "It always feels like there's something just under the surface here." I let out a weak laugh. "Wow, that's a fantastic thing to say to the person sitting in the front of the canoe." I'm serious, she said. Doesn't it feel full? Like there isn't only water down there. I wanted to make a joke, say something about fish and drowned trees, but the words got stuck. My paddle moved in and out of the water, dripping silver. The first thing that changed was the sound. I did not notice the exact moment it went silent. That is the strange part. One moment everything was normal. Frogs, a distant car on the access road, the faint murmur of the creek that fed the lake. The next, my mind tripped over a sudden absence. I lifted the paddle and rested it across my knees. "Do you hear that?" I asked. "What?" Harriet said, though from her face I knew she heard it too. "Nothing," I said. "That's the problem." There were no frogs, no insects, no cars. Even the air felt thicker, as if it were pressing from every side with invisible hands. The only sounds left were the faint tap of water against the hull and our breathing. For the first time since we had moved away from shore, Harriet looked directly at me. Her eyes shone too brightly in the dusk. "I read that article online before we came," she said. "Not just the clipping, the full article. It was stranger than the version on the board made it seem. People from the search team swore they saw things down there on sonar. Shapes that didn't move the way they should. They drained part of the lake one winter. It didn't get shallower in the center. It just changed." "You're scaring me," I said, half annoyed. "If this is a setup to freak me out, it's working. Congratulations." She did not smile. She leaned a little over the side of the canoe, as if she wanted to look deeper into the water. "Do you ever feel like something has been waiting for you?" she asked quietly. "Not metaphorically, for you specifically." The echo of her words trembled over the lake, too clear in that unnatural stillness. "Harriet, sit right," I said. "You're going to tip us." She ignored me. In the reflection, I saw us doubled, two pale faces floating over black, the canoe like a thin line between them. Then as I watched, the canoe's reflection stuttered. For a second, it lagged behind the real one and then snapped back into place. It happened again when I blinked, like a video freezing because of a bad connection. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Harriet nodded. "They finally chose me," she said. Before I could ask what that meant, she leaned farther, so suddenly that the canoe rocked. My reaction was pure instinct. I threw myself to the opposite side to compensate for the weight. The boat swayed, water slapped against the hull, and then she disappeared. There was no splash. That is the part that will never make sense to me. 1 second, Harriet's weight was in front of me, her hands resting on the gunwale. The next, the canoe floated empty. The water where she had been remained smooth as glass, our twin reflections intact. "Harriet." The word tore out of me, too loud in that suffocating silence. I fell to my knees and plunged my arms into the water, searching for anything. Fabric, skin, hair. My fingers only closed around cold. I screamed until my throat burned, her name bouncing against the dark slopes and returning smaller each time. By the time the others arrived in the second canoe, the sounds of the world had begun to seep back in. A frog croaked timidly near the shore. An engine growled somewhere along the road. The spell, if that was what happened, had lifted. We called, searched, and pushed through the reeds along the shore with flashlights stabbing the water. Rangers came. Divers came. They searched every inch they could reach. By dawn, the opposite shore looked like a crime scene from a show. Yellow tape, muddy footprints, exhausted faces. The official version settled quickly like sediment. She must have fallen into the water. Darkness, disorientation, shock. Even good swimmers can sink quickly. These things happen, people said, as if that offered any comfort. We went home without her. Grief counselors talk about bargaining. about how the mind repeats the facts while imagining different outcomes. I did that for months. If I had refused to go out one last time in the canoe, if I had grabbed her arm faster, if we had chosen another weekend, another lake. What I do not tell them is that sometimes, in the shower or while passing a dark storefront window, I see my reflection lag half a heartbeat behind me, just enough to make my stomach drop. It always catches up. But in that instant, I feel the same thick, expectant stillness rising around me. A year after it happened, I returned to Cedar Glass Lake alone. I do not know what I thought I would get. Maybe closure, maybe punishment. I walked down to the shore and stopped at the place where our canoe had first pushed off. The board still had the old article about the family from the 70s, its corners now bent and soft. Beneath it, someone had placed a new missing person poster with Harriet's face. The paper was fresh, the ink not yet run by rain. I did not get into any boat. I did not even step onto the wet rocks. I only stood there listening. The lake sounded normal. Birds, insects, wind. Ordinary life. Only once, when a cloud passed in front of the sun, everything became muffled for a second, leaving me alone with the silence. In that thin pocket of stillness, I felt something watching me from below. People tell me lakes are only water, depth, and physics. I nod. I say out loud that I agree. But now I know what real silence feels like. The kind that is not the absence of noise, but the presence of something listening. After that, I moved inland. I rent an apartment on a hill far from any true body of water. There is a small retention pond at the end of the street that collects rain in winter. I cross the street so I do not have to walk beside it. It is barely 10 feet wide, a puddle by any reasonable measure. But when the surface is still, I cannot make myself look down. I am afraid that someday, if I do, I will see two versions of myself staring back. The one standing on the shore, and the one half a second behind, waiting patiently for the water to become quiet enough to take my place. Story 5. The job that almost cost me my life did not look dangerous on paper. It was a contract position with a delivery company that served cabins and research sites along old closed logging roads in Oregon. I told myself it would be temporary, just a way to patch the hole in my bank account after my last office job disappeared. I also told myself I had always been good with maps, and that being alone in the forest felt more honest than being alone inside a cubicle. Most days, honestly, it was simple. I loaded the van at dawn, entered my route into the handheld GPS, and spent the rest of the day following a network of gravel roads that wound into the hills. The packages were almost always boring things: tools, shelf-stable food, replacement parts. The roads, on the other hand, were not. Some still had faded Forest Service numbers nailed to trees. Others were unofficial tracks that locals had carved over decades with the tires of their trucks, never appearing on any map. It was on one of those unmarked spurs that I met Callum. The first time he appeared as a silhouette in the dust ahead of me, a man in a faded green jacket and a baseball cap, raising one hand in a casual greeting. I braked on instinct. He stepped off to the side and waited until the van was level with him. "You're the new delivery driver?" he asked. His voice had that soft Pacific Northwest accent, the vowels rounded by rain. "I guess so," I said. "I'm still learning the roads." He smiled just enough to show his teeth. "Everyone is," he said. "The roads change here more than people think." He told me he lived near the ridge and sometimes stopped trucks when tourists got stuck or when a tree fell. He gave me directions around a washed-out stretch where half the road had been eaten away a mile ahead. They were exact. When I checked the updated route later, I realized he had saved me almost 40 minutes of work. After that, I saw him often. He would appear at intersections just as I was pulling out a map, leaning against a stump or a rock as if he had been there all afternoon. He always knew where I was headed before I told him. The cabin with the blue tarp roof. Stay left at the fork and then right by the broken culvert, he would say. Or, the research station with the weather tower. Don't bother with the old bridge. It's rotten. There's a newer crossing upstream. At first I was grateful. The handheld GPS only knew so much. The company's paper maps were old photocopies of even older maps. Callum seemed to have the entire network memorized. Not just the main routes, but the forgotten spurs and skid roads, too. You must have grown up around here, I said once, when he climbed onto the bumper to sit while we shared a lukewarm thermos of coffee. You could say that, he replied. I pay attention. That's how you stay alive in a country that doesn't care whether you're breathing. I laughed. He did not. The small things started to bother me before the big thing came. One afternoon, while we were standing beside the van going over my remaining deliveries, he said, "You've got 4 left, right? 2 through the canyon and 2 on the ridge." I frowned. I had not told him that. The manifest was folded in my pocket. The GPS device was still clipped inside the cab. "I guessed," he said when he saw my expression. "You've been running the same loop all week. Easy pattern." He was right. It could have been that. Except the next week when my route changed completely, he knew that too. "New cabin on the list," he said as he came down an embankment to meet me. "The old logger's place. Lots of junk in the yard. Be careful backing up. People disappear down that hollow." He said it so casually that I almost missed the last part. "Disappear how?" I asked. He shrugged. "Weather, bad decisions, other people. Pick one." After that day, I started filling out my end-of-shift reports in more detail. I wrote down when and where I ran into him. Even though there was no box for helpful frequent stranger, I told myself I was being paranoid, that I simply was not used to someone showing so much interest in my work. The day everything changed came heavy with fog. Low clouds stretched over the hills, and water droplets clung to the fir needles like sweat. That morning, the dispatcher had added a last-minute package to my route. A small box for an unlisted cabin with coordinates attached. When I entered the numbers into the handheld GPS, the point dropped into a blank corner of the map where the contour lines closed tightly together. "There used to be a road out there," the dispatcher had said. "Maybe it still exists. If you can't find it, bring the package back." I found Callum first. He was standing at the intersection where my main road narrowed into a deeply rutted spur, his hands in his pockets and his jacket darkened by moisture. "I was wondering when they'd send someone out here," he said. "You know this road?" I asked. "Better than your little device," he replied. "It's going to tell you it ends at 1.5 miles. It's wrong." I should have turned around. That is the part my therapist comes back to again and again. "You saw the sign," she says without saying the word sign, "and still you ignored it." "A cabin at these coordinates," I said, holding up the GPS. "You know it?" He did not even look at the screen. "I know it," he said. "I'll ride with you. Make sure you don't end up where you shouldn't." He climbed into the passenger seat before I could protest, with the confidence of an old friend. He smelled like wet wool and wood smoke. As we drove on, the fog thickened. The trees rose out of it and disappeared behind us. The road went from gravel to mud and then to something worse. Deep ruts filled with churned brown water. "You sure this is the right way?" I asked. "Positive," he said. The GPS started to glitch. The little arrow that represented us trembled, jumped backward, and then spun in place. After a while, it gave up completely and displayed signal lost in irritating letters. "Great," I muttered. We must be under some kind of tree cover. Maps lie, Callum said. Machines lie. The ground doesn't. He sounded almost pleased. We passed no driveways, no mailboxes, no sign that anyone lived out there. The forest pressed close, branches scraping the sides of the van like fingernails. The world shrank down to the two beams of the headlights and the hood shaking under my hands. I didn't think there were still cabins in service this far in, I said, if only to break the silence. Depends what you mean by service, he replied. We rounded a bend and the road simply ended. There was nowhere to turn around, no clearing. Only two ruts dissolving into brush and the dark wall of a ravine beyond. I put the van in park. Is this it? I asked. Callum unbuckled his seatbelt slowly. This is where the map says people stop existing, he said. The question is which side of that you want to be on. He turned in the seat to face me directly. His eyes, normally a washed-out gray, looked almost black in the dim light of the cab. You run these routes alone, he said. No partner, no dash cam, no one tracking you in real time. The company only cares that packages reach their destination or come back with a reason. If you disappear here, they'll send someone else in a week, maybe two. They'll mark the file unresolved and move on. He smiled, and it was the first time the smile did not reach his eyes at all. Or, he continued, you stop being cargo and start being someone who decides which trucks make it back to the depot. Someone who learns where the soft spots are, who owes favors to whom. There is always room for one more person who knows how these roads really work. My mouth went dry. Are you asking me to... what? Help you steal trucks? He let out a short, rough laugh. You think this is about stealing? Sometimes a truck is worth more empty. Sometimes someone wants a person to disappear without the problem of city cameras and witnesses. These roads are good for that. They have been for a long time. He paused. You have a choice. Be useful or be missing. The package on the seat between us suddenly felt like a prop in a bad play. I forced my voice to stay steady. You think I didn't tell anyone where I was going today? He tilted his head, studying me. Maybe you did. Most people don't. I radioed dispatch before I came up this spur, I lied. I gave them the coordinates. I told them I was with a local named Callum who offered to guide me. His jaw tightened slightly. You shouldn't lie so easily, he said quietly. Makes people wonder what else you're good for. Outside, the fog opened for an instant, revealing a strip of sky. Somewhere far away, a chainsaw roared and then cut off. An ordinary work sound, but it gave me something to hold on to. Either way, I said, my fingers slowly edging toward the gear shift. They know I'm late. They know where I'm supposed to be. If I don't check in on schedule, someone will come looking. We both knew how fragile that certainty was. Search areas out there were not measured in blocks, but in basins and ravines. But it gave me enough courage to act. I put the van in reverse and hit the accelerator. The tires spun in the mud for a heartbeat that felt like an hour. Then they caught. The van jerked backward. Callum grabbed the dashboard to steady himself. You're making a mistake, he snapped. Then report me to management, I said. Tell them I ignored your helpful advice. Branches shrieked against the sides as we bounced back down the spur. He did not try to grab the wheel. That scared me more than it would have if he had. He only watched me drive, his eyes flat and calculating, as if he were deciding whether I was worth the effort. At the intersection, I turned the wheel hard and got back onto the main road. Before the van fully straightened, Callum opened the door and stepped into the fog without a word, and I kept driving until I found gravel, then pavement, and finally the familiar ugly box of the depot emerging from the fog. I wrote "Road inaccessible, unsafe" on the package and left it on the manager's desk. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to sign my timesheet twice. I never saw Callum again after that. Not in person, at least. Sometimes, though, his absence felt more deliberate than accidental, as if he had simply stepped sideways out of my route and into someone else's. I quit 2 weeks later. Officially, it was for better opportunities. Unofficially, it was because I started noticing how many small news stories began the same way. Local driver fails to return from rural route. Vehicle found abandoned on logging road. The kinds of notices that briefly bubble up in the news and then sink beneath larger headlines. When I drive in the city now, I still catch myself checking the mirrors more than most people. I am not looking for patrol cars or tailgaters. I am looking for a figure in a faded green jacket standing at the edge of the road, raising one hand in that easy, casual greeting. I have learned to take the long way around any dead-end street. Out here, a road that looks like it simply ends rarely does. It only keeps going toward the places where the maps decided people did not need to follow. Story 6. I booked that trip to prove something to myself. After the breakup, everyone kept insisting that I needed to get back out there. By that, they meant dating apps, bars, parties. I chose another way of getting out. 3 nights alone on a popular loop inside a national park in Washington. A route I had saved to my favorites years earlier, but never found the time for. The kind of hike with enough day hikers to feel safe and enough miles to feel like I had accomplished something difficult. I did it responsibly. I left my sister a detailed itinerary. I checked in with a ranger at the backcountry permit office. I printed the map instead of trusting my phone. I reserved designated campsites along the loop, small numbered circles neatly arranged on the paper. The first 2 nights went so well that by the 3rd day, I started to feel too confident. My legs had remembered how to move. The backpack felt like part of my spine instead of a punishment. I had even started to enjoy the silences between trail conversations. Those stretches where it was only me and the rhythmic crunch of my boots. That was the day I decided to go to the hidden campsite. I had found it months earlier in a forum post, buried inside a thread about little-known sites. Someone had written, "There's an old unofficial spot off the main loop. Still flat, still near water. If you know, you know." They had left half-joking coordinates that did not quite match any of the numbered sites on my official map, but did line up with a small side trail marker I had noticed on the first day. By the time I reached the junction, the sky was already softening with afternoon light. The official campsite was another 1.5 miles ahead, with the guarantee of company, orientation, and the simple comfort of other people's campfires. The side trail, on the other hand, descended toward darker trees. I stood there for a full minute, my pack digging into my shoulders, weighing the boring safety of the known against the small, proud thrill of finding something secret. In the end, my ego won. The side trail was narrower than the main loop, but it was still clearly used. Pine needles had been flattened by boots. After 10 minutes, the trees opened into a small clearing so perfectly typical that it looked as if it had been placed there by a hiking company. Flat ground, a fire ring made of stones, a rough wooden bench made from a split log, initials carved along the edge. I dropped my pack and laughed out loud, a brief burst of relief. Part of me had expected to find nothing and be forced to backtrack to the official site by headlamp. But no. There it was, exactly as promised. While setting up my tent, I noticed that some of the initials on the bench were recent, the wood still pale where it had been cut. One set stood out, J plus P, carved inside a crooked heart. The letters were deep, as if whoever had made them wanted to be sure they would never fade. I cooked my dinner, hung my food bag from a branch that looked suitable, and sat on the bench watching the light drain from the clearing. There was something cozy about the way the trees closed around that space, like walls in a small outdoor room. I could hear the stream to my left, its current soft, steady, and soothing. I was zipping up my sleeping bag when I heard footsteps on the trail. They were quick and light, not the heavy stomp of someone carrying a full pack. A second later, a woman's voice called, "Hello? Is it okay if I come in?" The beam of a headlamp moved at the edge of the clearing. "Yes," I said, sitting up. "Of course." She appeared, lowering the light so she would not blind me. She looked to be in her early 30s, around my age. She had dark hair pulled into a braid and a red bandana loose around her neck. She carried a small day pack, nothing that looked like enough for spending the night. "Sorry," she said with an apologetic smile. "I wasn't sure anyone still used this place. I haven't seen it listed in years." "I guess that's kind of the point," I said. "I found it in an old forum thread." Her smile widened. "Same here. I'm Josephine," she said. "Do you mind if I share the fire for a while? I promise I'm not a murderer." The phrase was so cliché that it disarmed me. I climbed out of the tent and gestured toward the log bench. "Go ahead. I'm glad to know someone else knows this site exists." We fell into that easy conversation hikers have. Trail conditions, gear, the strange satisfaction of dehydrated meals. She knew the park well, mentioning alternate routes and small side lakes like someone who had been there many times. At some point, the conversation turned toward hiking alone. She asked who knew where I was, how specific I had been with my itinerary, whether I had posted my plans on social media. All of it was framed as concern. A lot of people share too much, you know. It isn't safe. But the questions themselves were precise. "Does your sister know the exact sites?" she asked. "This one too?" "Only the official ones," I said. I told her I might improvise a little if I found something interesting. I heard myself say it and felt a spark of doubt. Saying it out loud made it sound stupider. Josephine tilted her head. In the firelight, her eyes looked almost colorless. "So hypothetically," she said lightly, "if you didn't show up as planned, they would start searching the main loop." "I guess," I said. "There are only so many places to camp out here." "True," she said. "But there are more places than people think." A log shifted in the fire, releasing a shower of sparks. For one heartbeat, the clearing lit up more strongly. In that flash, her face looked wrong. Not monstrous, not deformed, just empty, like someone who had practiced the right expressions without ever having felt them. The air suddenly grew colder. "What about you?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound casual. "Who knows you're here?" She smiled again but did not answer. Instead, she leaned her elbows on her knees. "Do you ever think about how many people have slept right here?" she said, nodding toward the tent space. "How many stories have crossed this little piece of ground? Weddings, breakups, people trying to get over something, people who never come back." It should have been a normal campfire reflection, but the way she said "people who never come back" hung heavy in the air. I looked at the bench. J+P, sharp and recent. "You were here with someone before," I said quietly. For the first time, her expression flickered. Then she laughed too quickly. "Everyone was here with someone before," she said. "That's what makes it a good campsite." We kept talking a little longer, but the rhythm had broken. I felt like prey trying not to look like prey. Finally, she stood and brushed pine needles from her jeans. "I should get back," she said. "I'm at one of the numbered sites. My friends are waiting. You know how it is." "You hiked out here with only that?" I said, nodding toward her small pack. "Light and fast," she replied. "I like to move." She walked to the edge of the clearing. Her headlamp clicked on just before she disappeared among the trees. Then she stopped. "Hey," she said. "You didn't post about this place online, did you? Places like this get ruined when too many people know about them." "No," I said. "I didn't." "Good," she replied. "It's better when the forest chooses who finds it." I slept badly. Every crack of a branch sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind felt like breath against the wall of the tent. At some point, exhaustion finally dragged me under. When I woke, the clearing was full of mid-morning light. For one delicious second, everything seemed normal. Then I stepped outside. There was no firing. The circle of stones, the black ash, the half-burned log, all of it had disappeared. The ground where it had been was covered with untouched pine needles and small ferns, as if no one had built a fire there in years. The bench was gone too. In its place was only a scattered group of moss-covered stones. My tent and my footprints were the only signs that anyone had camped there. My heart slammed into my throat. I turned slowly in place. The same trees surrounded the clearing, but the space looked smaller, the walls closer. I grabbed my map and marched straight to the ranger station without stopping to eat. The ranger at the counter listened politely while I explained. The old forum, the hidden site, the other hiker, the campsite that had disappeared. My words tripped over each other, half apology, half accusation. He unfolded a large laminated map and traced our loop with a thick finger. "There used to be some unofficial sites off that side trail," he said at last. "We closed them years ago. Too much environmental impact. They aren't on any current list. There shouldn't be any firing there." "There was," I said. "And then there wasn't." He looked at me with the expression people use when they suspect you are very upset or slightly unstable. "Sometimes people move stones, clean up old sites," he said gently. "Leave them like nothing was ever there." "In one night?" I asked, "without leaving any sign?" He hesitated. Then he changed direction. "You said the other hiker's name was Josephine." "Yes," I replied. "Dark hair, red bandana. Knew the park really well. Said she used to come here with someone else." Something changed in his expression. "We had a missing person case 2 years ago," he said slowly. "A young woman, black hair. There was an unofficial site like the one you're describing where some of her things were found. She was last seen with a partner. First name started with P. We never found them. We don't publicize that place anymore." "Do you have a photo?" I asked. He shook his head. "Even if I did, I couldn't show it to you," he said. "Privacy. And it was a while ago. Memory can play tricks." I left the station feeling less anchored than when I had gone in. Maybe it had been a coincidence. Maybe there were a dozen dark-haired women with red bandanas who loved that loop. Maybe someone had removed every stone and burned branch while I slept because of an extreme obsession with leave no trace. Or maybe I had shared a fire with a story the forest had not finished telling. Back home, I deleted my old forum account. I stopped posting photos with location tags. When my friends asked me for route recommendations, I gave them the official campsites, the ones everyone knows. I never mentioned the clearing that was there one night and gone the next. Sometimes I think about the question Josephine asked me, the only one that seemed to truly matter to her. Who knows exactly where you are? These days when I hike, I make sure the answer is always more than one person. I text when I leave the trailhead and when I return. I stay where the maps say I am supposed to be. And if I ever find another small, perfect clearing that seems too eager to be discovered, I know which way to turn. Story 7. People talk about summit fever as if it is something dramatic, a kind of madness that catches you near the top and makes you reckless. In my experience, it is much quieter than that. It is just the idea that slowly crawls inside you, telling you that turning around would mean all the weeks of training, all the gear and all the planning were for nothing. That was the thought that had been circling our group for 2 days on Mount Rainier when the voices began. There were 4 of us on that attempt. I was the least experienced, the one who still checked every knot twice like a nervous student. Then there was Mia, tough and wiry, able to climb all day and still make jokes inside the tent. Our guide was an older climber named Sam, patient in the way only people can be when they have seen many egos deflate at high altitude. And then there was Rupert. If mountains could take human form, they would choose someone like him. Calm, methodical, solid. He never bragged about his experience, but every guide we passed on the lower glacier knew him by name. When he said a bridge was safe, you crossed it. When he said we were done for the day, you did not argue. The forecast looked decent when we left Paradise. A small system brushing the upper mountain, winds increasing overnight. Nothing unusual for that time of year. We set up high camp in a basin that felt like a frozen bowl of light. Tents dug into snow walls, stoves roaring, headlamps moving like fireflies as teams went through their routines. Above us, the upper slopes glowed faintly under a half moon, the ridges and seracs washed in silver. Alarm at midnight, moving at 1, Sam had said. If the wind is too strong, we reevaluate. The mountain will still be here next year. We all nodded. No one meant it. Sometime before the alarm, the wind arrived. At first, it announced itself as a low hum beneath the tent fabric. Then it became a full-body shove, a hand pressing hard against every surface. Snow hissed past, frozen grains hitting the nylon like sand. The temperature dropped so quickly that the moisture from our breath froze along the seams. Sam crawled out to check the lines and came back with his face stiff from the cold. "The gusts are ugly," he said. "We wait for a window. Hydrate, but stay in your bags. Nobody goes anywhere until I say so." I lay there in the dark, listening to my own breathing. The sounds of other teams moving outside, zippers, muffled shouts, slowly faded as more people made the same calculation. Not tonight. The tent walls bowed and flexed. At some point inside the white noise, I slipped into that thin, unsatisfying half-sleep that altitude produces. What woke me was not the wind. It was a sound woven into it. At first, I thought it was the fabric shrieking in a different pitch. Then it came again, cutting cleanly through the gust. A high, raw scream. I froze. The others shifted inside their sleeping bags. I heard Mia murmur something, a curse or a prayer. Another scream. Closer this time. Human, wordless, stretched until it barely sounded like a person. "There's someone out there," I said, my voice too loud inside the tent. Sam's headlamp snapped on. "Stay still," he said. "It could be the wind playing tricks." Another scream answered him. This one carried something like words, shredded by the gusts. "Help, please." My heart slammed against my ribs. "Sam," I said, "that isn't the wind." He was already unzipping the vestibule and sticking his head into the storm. A blade of freezing air entered the tent. He pulled himself back in quickly, snow crusting his eyebrows. "I don't see anyone," he said. "Visibility is garbage. Sound behaves strangely up here. It could be coming from the route. It could be coming from lower down. If we go out blind, we become the rescue." Mia swallowed. "We can't just lie here while someone is screaming for help." We all looked at Rupert. Until then, he had been quiet, his eyes open in the dimness, listening like someone tuning an instrument. Another scream rose, catching that same almost word. "Help." stretched into something between whale song and warning. He slowly shook his head. "Listen to the rhythm," he said. "It's riding the Gus almost exactly. Every time the wind drops, you hear it. That isn't someone stumbling around camp." "Then what else could it be?" I asked. He did not answer. The radio crackled then, making all of us jump. A sharp voice came through, half buried in static. "Hi, Camp. This is Ingram. Are you hearing anything strange up there?" "Over." Sam grabbed the transmitter. "Copy. We've been hearing something that sounds like calls for help. No visual. Do you have any rope teams unaccounted for on your side?" "Over." "Negative," came the reply. "Everyone who went up is back. Our people are getting spooked. Some say it sounds like a woman. There are no women climbers on our ropes tonight." "Over." All of us went completely still. Another scream tore across the ridge, louder than before, carrying a shape that made my skin prickle. It sounded like my name. Not perfectly. More like someone trying to remember it after a very long time. Syllables pulled from a frozen throat, but close enough that my stomach twisted. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" Mia asked. "It said..." I stopped. Saying it out loud felt like giving it weight. Inside my head, the sound repeated, and with it came a memory I had tried not to dust off too many times. Penelope standing at the foot of another mountain years earlier, her cheeks red from the cold, smiling at me over her shoulder. "Relax," she had said. "You worry enough for both of us." 2 hours later, we were caught in an avalanche. I came out with bruises. She did not come out. The last thing I remembered of her was that same smile, swallowed by white. Another gust struck the tent. The scream came with it, dragging my name again, now closer to recognizable. I must have made some sound because Rupert turned to look straight at me. Under the glow of the headlamp, the lines of his face looked deeper. "Who is Penelope?" he asked quietly. My mouth went dry. "I never said her name," I managed to answer. "You didn't need to," he said. "You're not the first person to bring a ghost up here." Something inside me wanted to argue, to tell him it was just stress, altitude, and thin air twisting my thoughts. But there was a stillness in his gaze that cut through the noise. "The mountain keeps stories," he said, "of every time someone screamed inside a storm and no one came. Sometimes when the weather is right, it plays them back. Sometimes it mixes them with what you already carry. So those," Mia began, "they could just be echoes? Old calls?" "They could be," he said. "Or maybe someone is out there right now and we can't reach them without joining them. Either way, running out into this won't fix anything." The radio squealed again. Another guide on another route reported hearing the same thing. There were no missing climbers. There were no tracks leading away from camp. The night stretched. The screams came and went, never closer, never farther, always riding the fall of each gust. At some point they changed. The rawness gave way to something more articulated. Phrases warped by distance. "Why did you get to leave? You could have pulled me out. Do not go down without me." Each accusation dropped into my chest like a stone. It was not Penelope's voice, not exactly, but it carried her cadence, her rhythm. Or maybe it carried my guilt shaped into sound. I do not remember sleeping. At some point, though, exhaustion must have dragged me under, because the next thing I clearly remember is Sam's voice. "Dawn," he said. "The storm opened up. Get up. We aren't going higher today." We crawled out of the tent into a world washed clean. The wind had dropped to a steady breeze. The sky above the summit was clear, a cold and impossible blue. Other teams emerged from their battered tents, radios in hand, faces tense. The route above us was empty. There were no wandering figures, no fallen silhouettes. When we scanned the slopes with binoculars, we saw only wind-scoured ridges and faint grooves of older tracks, already half filled by snow. The snow around camp told its own story. It was a mess of footprints and crampon marks, the hurried writing of a small, nervous village. Outside our tent, beyond the churned-up zone, the surface remained untouched. There was not a single set of tracks vanishing into the white. We all listened to that silence the same way, as proof and as accusation. Hours later at the ranger station, reports began coming in. Different teams in different areas of the mountain had heard the same thing. Screams in the storm, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes sounding like people they had lost. No missing person was reported. No abandoned camp was found. Atmospheric phenomena, a ranger said. Sound bounce. People get shaken up in bad weather. They start hearing what they're afraid of. Happens more than you think. I nodded, because that explanation was the only one that allowed me to stay inside my own skin. It is easier to believe your brain lied to you than to accept that a mountain might have memory. We returned to the city almost in silence without reaching the summit. Everyone I told afterward blamed it on stress. You made the right decision, they said. No summit is worth a life. The usual phrases. I did not tell them that I almost opened the tent and stepped outside when I heard my name. That part of me was already halfway to unclipping from the rope before I fully woke up. I did not tell them that the words I heard in the storm were the same ones I had been saying to myself for years. Why did you get to leave? You could have pulled me out. Now, whenever a winter storm passes over the city at night, with the wind tightening between apartment buildings, I stay awake and listen. It is a different sound from the high-altitude howl, tuned by brick and glass instead of ice and rock. But every now and then, beneath the gusts, I think I hear a familiar edge, a stretched syllable that wants to become my name. I do not climb big mountains anymore. I tell people it is because of my knees, my schedule, or because I never really liked the cold. The truth is simpler and harder to say. There is a limit to how many times you can stand in a place that amplifies every unfinished story inside you. The mountain will still be there next year, just as Sam said, and so will that storm, somewhere along its ridges, playing itself back for anyone high enough and hollow enough to hear it. I do not know what voices it will catch next time. I only know that for once. I chose to walk away while I could still tell the difference between the wind and the part of me that wanted to answer it.